Well, we're prepared now because we just purchased a pallet of bottles, so we're not relying on buying them in little batches.
What steps should a family take
If they show up,
to make effective decisions regarding buying something needed for the farm?
Decisions about purchasing for a farm. When we look at these types of decisions, we often think about trying to decide what's our priorities in the farm business, and what are some of the priorities in the family. And there's not enough dollars usually to meet all of those needs. But certainly people can think about what are the key items that need to be replaced, what are the key items that need to be purchased to make life on the farm easier, to make life in the home easier.
being a family business, almost all our decisions at the farm have some impact on our family.
You're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You gotta take something from here to pay for that, but you can't always pay everything at once.
When a conflict occurs about money, what should the family do? A purchasing conflict.
Well, clearly everybody needs to be heard about their position on it. Not everybody can get their way. I mean, it takes a certain amount of flexibility. I mean, a trade secret among family therapists is that pathology is rigidity and health is flexibility. And so the more flexibility there can be in a family, the healthier and the smoother things go. So compromise means that we don't get our first choice usually, that it might mean giving up certain things. And if that can be understood by everyone, and if that's a regular practice, that everyone's willing to make some compromises, as long as it's not so big of a compromise that there's going to be resentment and that there's going to be some a concern of it being unfair. I think it's a matter of that kind of flexibility, and usually things even out pretty well between family members if there can be that spirit of cooperation, flexibility.
Never growing up on a farm, okay, I used to visit farms, and I watched how they were run, and watched the problems, and it was always because either grandma or grandpa or mom or dad, somebody was the ultimate boss, and never let anybody else, join in. Every time we do something, we explain to them why we're doing it, and sometimes it takes 2 or 3 explanations as to what's happening, and then ask their advice.
I think there's one thing to be said around conflict resolution when conflict comes up. And that often means cooling down a little bit till you can find a better time to talk about it, because when adrenaline is coursing through people's systems, they're not going to be very good listeners. It's not going to go very well. A softer start goes a long way. Research has really indicated that when you bring up an issue, if it's in a softer way rather than already with pistols drawn, it's going to go better. So that there's a way to approach it when calmer, cooler, in a slower, softer way to present something when there is some conflict, because if things are heated up, so likely will escalate into an argument, into a heated conflict, and then people will avoid discussing things if that's typically how it will go, and then things don't get decided as a family. I think the other thing is conflict prevention, and it is in structures. Structures provide safety. There can be a ritual to it. It can be expected, but also it can avoid some of the pitfalls that typically happen when there isn't a structure. And so I think the best thing to do is to have these kinds of meetings and councils in place, and that can avoid, and I don't mean conflict avoidant in the typical conventional way, but more prevent conflict.
If there are just not enough resources, they're really robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're really struggling to make ends meet.
If people don't have a voice, if they don't have a say in terms of the budget cuts or whatever it might be, there can be far more conflict than if it's approached as a group in terms of we have a scarcity of resources, and what can we do about it, rather than it being a top-down hierarchical issue in terms of it being dictated or decided upon for the members, but for the family members to decide together, collaboratively, collectively.
There's a finite amount, and so how are we going to manage with less? How are we going to manage with not getting as much as we would like to have? And how are we going to apportion that little amount? And who's going to decide that? Again, it depends on who it affects and how are we going to decide it. But I think, again, with the model that Mark spoke about, again, it's all the more important, because if we're going to be having some degree of frustration or suffering even about what we're not going to have, or not going to be able to have, or not going to get, or it's going to be taken away, then we want to have in just that much more family support and that much more family agreement around those decisions, because that's what's going to hold those together, and that's what actually is going to comfort the individuals. That's the medication, I think, and the process that actually feels some level of soothing for folks who essentially will be hurting.